When Grant Mercer returned to his family's abandoned ranch, he expected weeds, broken fences, and silence. Instead, he found 24 luxury homes, a guarded clubhouse, and a smiling HOA president claiming his land belonged to her community. Felicity Voss offered him $5,000 to disappear. Grant refused. Buried inside his grandfather's records was a deed the developers had never legally erased, and a century-old lease clause powerful enough to turn every mansion road and swimming pool into rental property. The HOA had built an empire on stolen ground. Now Grant intended to collect every dollar they owed in full. Subscribe, and stay with Grant, as one forgotten deed forces an HOA board to pay rent on their own mansions. After his father's funeral, Grant Mercer received a small box of old documents and a single rusted key to a gate he barely remembered from childhood. The will left him little cash, but it transferred full ownership of 186 acres that had belonged to the Mercer family since 1912, when his grandfather Silas first bought the land. Grant had spent his career as a land surveyor reading boundary lines and title records most people never thought twice about, and he assumed reclaiming a forgotten ranch would be a quiet formality. His mother had died years earlier, his father had moved away for medical care, and the property had sat untouched for nearly 12 years. When Grant finally drove out to the address listed on the deed, the dirt road he remembered had become a paved boulevard, lined with manicured hedges, and a wrought iron gate blocked his path with a uniformed guard standing beside it. Behind that gate stood 24 luxury homes, a shared swimming pool, a private tennis court, and a clubhouse that looked like it cost close to $6 million to build. Security cameras tracked every vehicle along the private roads, and a polished sign near the entrance declared that everything beyond it belonged to Silverbriar Estates, a homeowners association Grant had never heard of. He checked his GPS twice, certain he had made a wrong turn, but the coordinates confirmed he was standing in the exact center of what used to be the eastern half of the Mercer Ranch. When he showed the guard his ownership documents, the man barely glanced at them before picking up a radio and calling someone named Felicity. Felicity Voss arrived in a gleaming SUV, dressed like she had stepped out of a boardroom rather than a residential community, and she did not look surprised when she heard the name Mercer. That absence of surprise told Grant everything he needed to know. She had known about his family long before he ever showed up at her gate. She explained, almost bored, that Silverbriar Estates had purchased the land legally from a development company 8 years earlier, and she referred to Grant's paperwork as a worthless relic from another era. When Grant asked to see the actual transfer records, she refused outright and instructed the guards to escort him off what she called her property. Before he left, Grant noticed something the guards had missed. Near the base of the entrance wall, several stones were carved with a single letter, an M, the exact mark his grandfather had used decades earlier to mark boundary posts across the ranch. This was not land near the Mercer property. This was the Mercer property buried under new asphalt and imported landscaping. Felicity offered him a check for $5,000 on the spot, calling it a generous gesture for a stack of decaying paperwork, but Grant simply photographed the check and handed it back without a word, telling her that she had just confirmed she knew he had a legitimate legal claim. Her smile disappeared instantly, and as Grant drove away, she was already on the phone with her attorney Everett Sloan, telling him the Mercer heir had surfaced and needed to be kept far away from any judge. Driving away from that gate, Grant found himself replaying every detail of the encounter, the confidence in Felicity's voice, the way she had recognized his last name before he even finished introducing himself, and the calm certainty of the pars. A woman who believed no amount of old paperwork could threaten what she had built. He remembered his grandfather Silas as a stubborn, quiet man who rarely spoke about the ranch except to say that the family had fought hard to keep it during years when many neighboring farms had been swallowed up by larger operators. Grant had grown up hearing stories about surveyors and lawyers circling the property decades earlier, always looking for a weak point in the paperwork, and he began to wonder whether Silverbriar Estates was simply the modern version of the same old hunger. Grant rented a small room near the county records office and spread every document his father had saved across the table. Inside the box were the original 1912 ownership certificate, a boundary survey from 1936 continuous property tax filings up until 12 years earlier, and a handful of letters between his father and the development company called Briar Summit Holdings. There was also an unsigned contract offering to purchase the land for $1.8 million, along with a handwritten note in his father's script that simply read, "Do not sell, they have no right to build here." It was immediately clear that his father had never agreed to any transfer. At the county office, the digital system showed that Briar Summit Holdings had registered ownership through what was labeled a special transfer deed, but the signature attributed to Grant's father looked nothing like his real handwriting. Grant tracked down Warren Beckett, a county land records inspector who had once handled that exact parcel, and though Warren initially refused to talk, he opened up once Grant produced the original 1936 survey. Warren admitted he had flagged 3 serious problems during the original approval process. The transfer deed lacked a valid notarization, the development's boundary line overlapped more than 160 acres of Mercer land, and a public access road had been quietly converted into a private street without the legally required hearing. Warren had submitted a formal warning report years earlier, but it vanished from the system shortly after a county official met privately with representatives from Briar Summit Holdings. When Grant asked if any copy still existed, Warren admitted the official file was gone, but he had personally kept a draft in his own storage because he never wanted his name tied to what he suspected was fraud. Early one morning, Grant and Warren approached the edge of Silver Briar with survey equipment to locate one of the original boundary markers, which according to the coordinates should have sat directly beneath the landscaped garden near the clubhouse. When they dug down, they found the Mercer boundary post snapped in half and sealed under a slab of poured concrete. A security camera caught the activity, and within minutes, Felicity and Prescott Hale arrived with a team of guards, accusing Grant of trespassing and destruction of HOA property. Felicity called the police and demanded his arrest, but Grant calmly presented his ownership certificate, his survey coordinates, and a formal dispute notice he had filed with the county that very morning. The responding officers declined to make an arrest, ruling it a civil matter rather than a crime, which sent Felicity into a fury as she threatened to sue him for trespassing, harassment, and property damage. Grant lifted the cracked marker stone from the dirt, looked directly into one of the HOA's own security cameras, and told her that at least those cameras had captured decent evidence. That night, Felicity ordered Prescott to hire a crew to remove every remaining Mercer boundary marker before Grant could locate them, unaware that Grant had already installed his own hidden monitoring equipment along the property line. Grant hired attorney Odessa Pike, who confirmed after reviewing everything that the case carried enormous potential value, but she warned him that owning the land on paper would not automatically restore his physical control of it. She explained that a well-funded HOA could stretch a case for years by arguing statute of limitations, adverse possession, blaming the defunct developer, demanding compensation for existing structures, or simply draining Grant financially, until he agreed to sell his claim outright. Odessa filed for a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from selling additional properties, destroying boundary evidence, or altering the current condition of the disputed land. The night before the hearing, Grant's hidden cameras captured Prescott and 3 workers, digging up the remaining stone markers and loading them into a truck, and rather than intervene, Grant simply recorded the footage, the license plate, and the exact coordinates for later use. That same night, his rented room was broken into, though nothing of value was taken, except that his box of Mercer documents had clearly been searched through. Fortunately, he had already digitized everything and sent copies to Odessa, and when he discovered a tracking device attached beneath his own vehicle, he chose to leave it in place, letting Felicity believe she still knew exactly where he was. At the injunction hearing, Everett Sloan accused Grant of trying to extort an innocent community using unreliable decades-old paperwork, while Felicity sat quietly behind him, projecting calm confidence. Everett argued that the HOA had never directly purchased land from the Mercer family, that homeowners had bought their properties in good faith, that Grant had raised no objection during 8 years of construction, and that tearing anything down would cause tens of millions in damages. Odessa never asked for demolition. Instead, she played the footage of Prescott destroying boundary markers, mere hours after Grant filed his official dispute, and when the judge asked why the HOA would bother destroying stones it claimed were worthless, Everett had no answer. The court granted the temporary injunction barring the HOA from selling or mortgaging further property, destroying records or markers, and requiring them to hand over every purchase document within 10 days, while allowing Grant to conduct an independent survey. Felicity remained outwardly unbothered, quietly telling Grant outside the courtroom that the injunction would only cost him more money in the long run. Grant reminded her that she had just been legally forced to surrender her financial records to him, which was precisely what he wanted all along. Reviewing the required document list that night, Grant discovered that Briar Summit Holdings had dissolved as a company almost immediately after completing the project, and the person who had signed the dissolution paperwork was none other than Prescott Hale, proving the HOA and the developer were never truly separate entities the way Everett had claimed. Under court order, the HOA delivered thousands of pages of documents deliberately disorganized in an apparent attempt to slow Odessa's review. But Grant's survey background let him cross-reference zoning maps, contracts, bank loans, tax filings, individual property deeds, and internal board meeting minutes with remarkable speed. He calculated that Silver Briar Estates was worth approximately $68 million in total. Among the paperwork sat a deed, claiming Grant's father had sold the land to Briar Summit Holdings for $400,000. Yet no bank record anywhere showed that payment ever being transferred, and the notary who supposedly certified The signature had left his job 2 full years before the document's listed date. Worse still, sealed board meeting minutes revealed Felicity had once asked Everett directly about what she called the Mercer risk before the very first villa broke ground. Everett had responded in writing that the risk would drop significantly if no heir appeared before the project reached completion, proving beyond doubt that they had known about the ownership dispute from the very beginning. Grant also uncovered a planning map with a handwritten note in Prescott's script, instructing someone to cover the old markers before the final inspection. Panic began setting in for Marla Keene, who realized Felicity and Prescott intended to make her the fall guy for every irregular payment the HOA had ever made, and she quietly reached out to Grant, arranging to meet him at a diner far from Silver Briar. Marla revealed that the HOA had funneled $3.4 million from its reserve fund into 3 separate companies: Hale Infrastructure, Voss Community Consulting, and Sloan Municipal Services, each one tied directly to a member of the board. In exchange for legal protection, she handed Grant a hard drive containing the unedited board meeting recordings, including audio of Felicity, stating flatly that the Mercer family would never have enough money to fight back. Marla explained that she had joined the board years earlier, believing she was simply helping manage a well-run community, and that she had convinced herself the irregular payments were standard business practice until the amounts grew too large to ignore. She admitted she had seen Prescott's name on invoices that made no sense for a residential association, and that she had stayed quiet out of fear rather than loyalty. A fear that had only grown once she realized Felicity was already positioning her as the person to blame if anyone ever asked hard questions. Grant chose not to release the recording immediately, preferring that Felicity continue believing Marla remained loyal to her. Meanwhile, Felicity called an emergency meeting of the homeowners, painting Grant as a con artist attempting to steal their homes, and urging every household to contribute an additional $25,000 to a special legal defense fund aimed at fighting him. Grant showed up at that meeting under his court-approved access rights, making clear he had no intention of removing families who had purchased their homes without knowledge of the underlying fraud, and that his real target was the people who had knowingly built and profited on stolen land. Felicity cut his microphone and ordered security to remove him, but not before he placed a copy of the sealed minutes referencing the Mercer risk on the table for every homeowner to see. He asked her plainly why she had told them she had never even heard the Mercer name before, and the room fell into stunned silence. Several residents began openly questioning the board for the first time, and for a moment, Felicity lost control of the room entirely. Though, after Grant left, she vowed she would not let him take a single brick from Silver Briar, ordering Everett to prepare a $40 million countersuit. The HOA's countersuit accused Grant of destroying property value, interfering with existing contracts, spreading alarming misinformation, delaying home sales, trespassing on secured property, and damaging the Silver Briar brand. Everett offered a settlement of $300,000 in exchange for Grant abandoning his ownership claim and signing a strict confidentiality agreement, and Odessa warned that even a weak countersuit could still bury Grant in legal costs he could not sustain. Grant briefly considered selling his father's small house just to keep fighting, but before making that decision, he returned to his grandfather Silas's old notebook and found a reference to a 1931 agreement between the Mercer family and a timber company called North Valley Timber Cooperative. During hard economic times, Silas had not sold the land outright, but instead granted the timber company a 99-year right to use part of the property with a critical clause buried in the contract. If any permanent structure was ever built without the written approval of the landowner, the property owner retained the right to demand demolition, seize the structure outright, or apply retroactive and ongoing ground rent for the entire duration of the lease. Grant tracked down the original filing at the State Archive and confirmed the agreement was still legally registered, with nearly 4 years remaining on its 99-year term. North Valley Timber had dissolved decades earlier, but the limited leasehold rights had quietly passed through a chain of shell companies before eventually landing with Briar Summit Holdings, which had tried to twist a restricted lease into permanent, unrestricted ownership. Grant realized he did not need to tear Silver Briar down at all. He could simply force the HOA to start paying ground rent. Odessa hired an appraiser who calculated a fair market rental value for all 24 villa lots, the clubhouse, the pool, the private roads, the landscaping systems, and the commercial amenities, arriving at a combined monthly figure of $214,000. Factoring 8 years of retroactive rent, accumulated interest, and unauthorized use penalties, the total owed could exceed $26 million, though Grant chose not to reveal that number right away, instead sending Everett a formal notice, invoking the third option under the 1931 contract, conversion of the property into a ground lease arrangement. Everett initially mocked the document, but after verifying its registration number, his expression changed completely because the clause had been recorded before any of Silverbrier's mortgages, construction permits, or property deeds, giving it priority over every existing financial claim against the community. Felicity refused to believe any court would enforce a contract nearly a century old, but Everett explained that its age was irrelevant since it remained active, and the HOA had inherited the obligation through the same chain of shell companies they had used to build their claim of ownership. If the court confirmed it, Silverbriar would not actually own the ground beneath any of its homes. Felicity insisted they simply tear up the agreement, and Everett reminded her that she could not disavow a contract she had personally used to obtain the original building permits. Grant mailed the HOA its first rent invoice, $214,000, due within 30 days, along with a warning that failure to pay would trigger formal proceedings to reclaim use of the entire property. Felicity tore the invoice apart in front of the board and ordered everyone to ignore it, dismissing Grant as a man playing games. Marla warned that ignoring the notice could cost the HOA access to its roads, clubhouse, and shared utility systems. But Felicity accused her of disloyalty on the spot. At the next board meeting, held under Odessa's request for Grant to attend directly, he laid out 3 possible paths forward. The first option required the HOA to pay the full $26 million in retroactive rent and continue paying $214,000 every month going forward. The second option allowed the HOA to negotiate a new long-term lease with Grant reducing the old debt while guaranteeing residents would not lose their homes. The third option would let Grant terminate the lease, entirely reclaim all shared property outright, and pursue personal fraud claims against every board member individually. Felicity laughed and declared the board would not pay him a single dollar. So Grant asked each member present whether Everett had informed them that the HOA's liability insurance did not cover intentional fraud. The room went quiet. If Felicity, Prescott, Marla, and the others had known about the ownership dispute yet approved construction anyway, each of them could face personal financial responsibility. Grant produced copies of the sealed minutes bearing every one of their signatures, and Prescott exploded, slamming his fist on the table and threatening Grant directly, only for Grant to calmly point out the HOA's own security camera, recording every word of it. Later that night, Felicity attempted to transfer $6 million out of the reserve fund into another company, but Marla secretly blocked the transaction and alerted Odessa immediately. Odessa filed an emergency motion to freeze the HOA's accounts, and the court agreed after reviewing evidence of the attempted transfer stripping Felicity of control over the reserve fund entirely. Around the same time, Grant held a separate meeting with homeowners, drawing a clear line between residents and the board, explaining that people who had purchased homes without knowledge of the fraud would be protected, that he had no interest in forcing them out, that the board alone had collected fees, sold rights, and buried the truth, and that any resolution would prioritize resident stability above all else. That message unraveled Felicity's public relations campaign, as more residents began viewing Grant as the person trying to save them from the board's own misconduct, and a growing group formally demanded her resignation. She refused to step down and instead quietly amended the HOA bylaws during a closed meeting, granting herself the power to suspend voting rights for anyone deemed a threat to the community. Grant had anticipated the move, and Odessa proved the amendment violated the standing injunction and lacked the required votes to pass. The judge voided the change immediately and appointed an independent monitor to examine the HOA's finances in full. That monitor's investigation revealed something explosive. 4 board members, including Felicity and Prescott, owned villas sitting directly on the section of land the 1931 contract had explicitly marked as forbidden for construction. That meant the board had not merely managed illegal buildings from a distance. They personally lived inside homes they knew had been built on land belonging to the Mercer family. Grant sent 4 individual lease agreements directly to those board members, each one demanding monthly ground rent paid to him personally. Felicity received an invoice for $18,500 for her own villa. This time she did not tear it up. Everett soon announced they had located a newly discovered deed in a private archive claiming Grant's grandfather had sold the property outright back in 1954. If genuine, that document would erase both the 1931 lease and Grant's current ownership claim entirely. Felicity held a press event outside the Silverbriar gates, publicly accusing Grant of orchestrating an elaborate fraud against innocent families and demanding he apologize, unveiling the 1954 deed as proof. Grant did not react immediately, choosing instead to examine the document carefully, and he found several glaring inconsistencies almost right away. The paper stock had not been manufactured until after 1962. The notary registration number did not exist in 1954. His grandfather's middle name was misspelled. The land description used a coordinate system the county did not adopt until many years later, and the official seal belonged to a notary office that had since relocated. Grant brought in a forensic document examiner to test the ink and paper, and the results confirmed the deed had been created within the last 3 years, not 7 decades earlier. Odessa requested a court order compelling investigation into the document's origin, and Everett claimed an anonymous archive employee had mailed it to their office. But metadata from the scanned copy traced back to a computer registered to Sloan Municipal Services, the very company that had received millions of dollars from the HOA. Marla turned over an internal email in which Felicity had explicitly asked Everett to find, in her words, a historical solution strong enough to bury Mercer for good. Prescott had also emailed Everett a photo of an old notary seal 2 weeks before the fabricated deed suddenly appeared. At the hearing, Everett attempted to withdraw the deed, calling its submission an honest mistake, but the judge refused to allow it. The court referred the matter to investigators on charges of forging a legal document fraud upon the court, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal rightful ownership, along with the earlier misuse of HOA reserve funds. Felicity immediately tried to shift blame onto Everett, and Everett shot back that he had only followed the board's own instructions. And in that moment, the alliance between them shattered in open court. Grant presented his complete survey findings, proving every road lot and structure inside Silver Briar sat squarely within the historic Mercer boundary, and Warren Beckett confirmed under oath that his original warning report had mysteriously vanished from the county system years earlier. A handwriting expert confirmed the signature on the earlier transfer deed had been forged, and bank records showed no evidence the Mercer family had ever received the claimed $400,000 payment. Felicity was called to testify and stated under oath that she had never even heard of the Mercer family before Grant's sudden appearance. Odessa then played a recording from a board meeting held 9 years earlier, and Felicity's own voice filled the courtroom, instructing the board to finish construction before the Mercer family could return, insisting that once families had moved in, no judge would ever dare hand the land back. The courtroom fell completely silent, and Grant did not even look at Felicity. He watched only the judge because this was the moment the case stopped being a paperwork dispute and became undeniable proof of a deliberate, calculated scheme. The judge announced a full trial, covering final ownership, retroactive rent, and the personal liability of every board member involved. And Felicity finally understood she no longer had insurance, no longer had access to the reserve fund, and no longer had a dissolved company to blame everything on. Over the following weeks, Odessa built her case in 3 distinct layers. The first established that the Mercer family had never legally signed away the land, making Grant the rightful heir to the entire parcel. The second confirmed that Briar Summit Holdings could only have inherited a limited leasehold interest from the earlier chain of companies, never full ownership. The third proved deliberate, calculated fraud, showing that Felicity Prescott and the other implicated board members had known about the dispute, yet still destroyed boundary markers, forged documents, misused HOA funds, sold homes on land they did not legally control, hid the truth from buyers, and countersued Grant purely to pressure him into abandoning a legitimate legal claim. Everett argued that Grant had abandoned the land for far too long to have any remaining claim, but Odessa countered that simply leaving land unused never equals surrendering legal ownership of it. The HOA could not claim adverse possession either, since its own documents acknowledged that the leasehold rights originated from the original Mercer agreement, meaning they had already recognized the family's ownership and could not simultaneously argue against it. The judge's ruling was sweeping and precise. Grant Mercer held rightful legal ownership of the land beneath Silver Briar Estates. The 1931 lease remained fully enforceable. Every structure built without authorization was subject to ground rent. The HOA owed retroactive rent, accumulated interest, and unauthorized use penalties. Felicity Prescott and every board member who had signed the fraudulent minutes bore personal financial liability. Homeowners unaware of the underlying fraud retained the right to remain in their homes during restructuring, and the HOA was ordered to negotiate a new lease or risk losing its shared property entirely. Throughout the trial, Grant sat through hours of testimony without ever raising his voice, letting the documents and recordings carry the weight of the argument while he simply answered questions when asked. He described growing up hearing about the land from his father, the long stretches when nobody in the family had the money or the energy to fight for a property that seemed destined to sit empty forever, and the strange feeling of standing at that gate for the first time and realizing an entire community had been built on the assumption that no one from his family would ever come looking. Odessa later told him that jurors and judges alike tend to respond to restraint far more than outrage, and that his refusal to perform anger in the courtroom had done more to establish his credibility than any single piece of paperwork. The total debt was calculated at $27.8 million in amount. The HOA's remaining assets could not fully cover, giving Grant the legal right to force the sale of the clubhouse, pool, and other shared amenities. if he chose to. Felicity accused him of planning to destroy the entire community just to collect his money, but Grant proposed an alternative instead. He agreed to significantly reduce what individual residents owed if the current board resigned, if Felicity, Prescott and the other implicated members personally guaranteed their outstanding debts if the HOA signed a 30-year ground lease directly with him, if rent for ordinary residents remained fixed at a sustainable rate, if the board members, responsible for the fraud, paid a higher personal rate, and if a portion of the recovered funds went toward restoring the historic areas of the Mercer property. The homeowners accepted immediately. Felicity refused to sign, insisting Grant had no right to charge her rent for a home she had purchased with her own money, and Grant calmly explained that she owned the structure itself but never the ground underneath it. Without a signed lease, she would either have to physically move the villa off Mercer land or surrender the structure entirely under the terms of the original contract, and relocating an entire villa was practically impossible. On B1, board members entered the settlement room and signed their new lease agreements, until only Felicity remained, and Grant placed the pen in front of her, reminding her that 9 years earlier she had bet the Mercer family would never come back. And today was the day she paid off that bet in full. She signed. The new lease agreements officially took effect, and Silverbriar Estates continued to exist, but every record now clearly reflected that Grant Mercer controlled the underlying land, his name appearing across county property records ground, lease agreements, utility filings, zoning maps, HOA, financial season, notices, and every shared use agreement for the roads and clubhouse. Each former board member now owed a separate monthly rent based on how deeply they had participated in the fraud. Felicity paid $18,500 a month and carried the largest retroactive balance, having lost her position as chairwoman and been permanently barred from holding any financial leadership role within the COMSER community. Prescott paid $15,000 monthly, remained financially responsible for the destroyed boundary markers and the shell construction companies tied to his name, and had his voting rights suspended indefinitely. Everett, who owned no home in the community, was ordered to repay the legal fees. The HOA had funneled through him and now faced professional disciplinary proceedings, along with an active investigation into the forged deed and his false freight testimony. Marla also signed a lease as a former board member, but because she had cooperated fully and helped block the illegal fund transfer, Grant offered her a significantly reduced rate. She still faced consequences for her early silence, but was never treated the same as Felicity or Prescott. Every remaining board member wrote checks or set up recurring payments to Grant each month, and the transaction description on every single one read plainly Mercer Family Land Rent. Grant never used the money to build anything flashy or to flaunt his victory. Instead, he used the first payments to restore the original Mercer stone wall, build a small land management office just outside the main gate, repair his family's old storage barn, reset the boundary markers across the property, establish a legal protection fund for the land itself, and audit the Prusence HEA community's entire drainage and internal road system. Residents later voted to rename the main road from Silverbriar Boulevard to Mercer Ridge Road, and from that point forward, Felicity drove past a sign bearing the very family name she had once tried to erase from every official record. When her very first payment arrived 3 days late, Grant applied the exact late penalty the HOA itself had once used against ordinary residents, charging her an additional $1,250. She called to complain, calling the fee cruel and unreasonable, and Grant simply mailed her a copy of the very policy she herself had signed while serving as chairwoman. He said nothing more. The paperwork spoke for itself. At the first HOA meeting under the new leadership, Grant did not sit in the chairman's seat. He sat quietly at the back of the room as a landowner rather than a resident, while the former board members lined up to sign their monthly payment confirmations one after another. Prescott refused to make eye contact with him. Marla signed hers without a word. Felicity paused before her copy for a long moment, but eventually she picked up the pen and signed anyway. Grant accepted the confirmation and told the room plainly that he had not taken anyone's home away. He had simply forced everyone to admit the land beneath those homes had never truly belonged to them. Shortly after that meeting concluded, investigators arrived at the clubhouse with a warrant to search the HOA's old financial servers, marking the true end of the civil case, even as the criminal accountability was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed, word of the case spread far beyond Silverbriar itself, reaching other communities built during the same rapid development boom that had produced the original project. Grant began receiving calls from people in neighboring counties who suspected their own family land might have been absorbed into similar developments through the same kind of shell company maneuvering that Prescott and Felicity had relied on. He did not chase every lead, but he passed along what he had learned to Warren, and to a handful of honest inspectors who were now paying far closer attention to boundary disputes than they had before the case became public. Odessa noted privately that the ruling had already begun shifting how title insurers in the region reviewed decades-old transfer documents, since no company wanted to underwrite a deal that might later collapse under the same kind of scrutiny Grant had applied to his own land. 6 months later, Silverbriar Estates looked entirely different, though not because it had been torn down. Property values stabilized once the underlying land rights were finally made transparent through an enforceable lease. A new board made up entirely of residents, with no connection to the original fraud, took over, and every fee contract and meeting became fully public for the first time in the community's history. Grant became the landowner behind the community, but he never interfered in the daily lives of the families living there, retaining approval rights only over changes affecting the property's boundaries, natural resources, or historical significance. The criminal investigation produced serious consequences across the board. Felicity was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of evidence, and use of a forged legal document. Prescott faced charges for destroying government-recognized boundary markers and manipulating the defunct development company. Everett's license faced suspension proceedings. A former county official came under investigation for deleting Warren's original report years earlier, and the funds funneled into the shell companies were ordered returned. Marla cooperated fully, with prosecutors receiving a lighter sentence in exchange, though she still had to surrender every dollar of improper benefit she had received. Felicity remained in her villa while her case proceeded, permitted to stay only as long as she continued paying her rent on time, and each month, Grant received her payment without a single threat, without a single press conference, just a people end. Quiet, automatic transfer labeled Mercer Family Land Rent. Grant transformed his grandfather's old storage barn into a small historical archive, its walls now lined with the 1936 survey map, the original 1912 ownership certificate, photographs of the restored Mercer boundary stones, a copy of the 1931 lease agreement, and the $5,000 check Felicity had once tried to use to make him disappear. He had that check framed but never cashed, and beneath it hung a simple handwritten note explaining that this was the price someone once believed could buy his silence. At the small opening event for the archive, Warren Beckett arrived to personally hand Grant the original report that had been deleted from the county system years earlier, and Grant thanked him for preserving the truth when everyone else around him had simply looked the other way. Odessa asked Grant almost casually whether he had ever seriously considered tearing the entire community down. Grant admitted he had thought about it on that very first day at the gate, but demolishing the homes would only create new victims in hand. Felicity, an easy excuse to paint him as the villain, forcing the board to pay rent instead, had proven far more powerful. It protected the buyers who never knew the truth. It restored the Mercer family's rightful ownership, and every single month it reminded the very people responsible that their wealth had been built on land that was never truly theirs. 1 year after Grant first returned to his family's land, he stood again in front of the same gate that had once turned him away. The Silverbriar Estates sign still hung above the entrance, but beneath it now ran a smaller line of text reading, located on Mercer family land, established 1912. A car slowed to a stop at the checkpoint, and Felicity sat behind the wheel, glancing at Grant without saying a word. The gate attendant scanned her card and reminded her matter-of-factly that her rent for the month was due by Friday. Grant did not gloat, did not smile, and did not say a single word to provoke her. He simply stepped aside and let her drive past onto the road that now carried his family's name. He walked over to the restored Mercer boundary stone, its carved letter M finally visible again, after Felicity had once tried to bury it beneath a slab of concrete. The land was no longer silent or abandoned the way it had been when he first inherited it, but for the first time in decades, every deed sign and contract told exactly the same truth. Silverbriar could own its villas. The HOA could manage its roads. The residents could call this place home. But the land itself still belonged to the Mercer family, and everyone who had once tried to steal it now paid every single month for the privilege of staying on it. Power can hide the truth for years, but it can never turn stolen property into legitimate ownership. Felicity believed that building a community worth tens of millions of dollars would make it impossible for the Mercer family to ever reclaim what was theirs. In the end, the very mansions she was so proud of became the clearest proof of the debt she owed. Grant never won through money, threats, or destruction. He won because he understood exactly what belonged to him, gathered his evidence with patience, and refused to let his own anger turn innocent families into casualties of someone else's greed. The HOA once demanded that Grant Mercer leave his own land behind. 1 year later, the entire board was paying rent just to be allowed to stay.